Right, so Revelation chapter 12 this evening is what we're going to be looking at. This is the section of the book that is called the Deeper Spiritual Background, chapters 12 through 22. And as we have been doing all the way up until now, I've got a chart there on the screen that you can see. Kind of gives us, it's kind of our roadmap to see where we are in the book of Revelation structurally. So we are in the second half now of the book. Remember, the book of Revelation divides very nicely into two halves. Chapters 1 through 11, chapters 12 through 22 are the two halves. Both halves of the book of Revelation tell the exact same story. But the first half, the first telling of the story, let's say it that way, tells it from the earthly perspective. The second half, or the second telling of the story, if I'll say it that way, tells the story but gives the deeper spiritual background. And so we are in that second half. Specifically, we are now in chapters 12 through 14, which are a section of that second half that discuss war, spiritual warfare. And this evening in chapter 12, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the first three of 7 characters that are introduced to us in this section. We're going to look at the woman, the dragon, and the man-child. We're going to get to that in just a moment. But if you were here Wednesday night, you remember, maybe you remember at any rate, that I said that tonight we're going to start off with a scene from a Hollywood movie that really, I think, describes very well what we are doing in chapters 12 through 22 of the book. And maybe if you've been in Revelation with me before, you know what Hollywood movie that is. If not, I'm going to share it with you because what we have here in chapters 12 through 22, this deeper spiritual background, is we have a pulling back of the curtain. And of course, that is a scene from The Wizard of Oz. I think probably everybody listening to this Bible class tonight is familiar with the movie The Wizard of Oz. You've got Dorothy, you got Toto over there in the far right of the picture. And of course, you've got the Wizard of Oz. And what happens in the movie is that everybody's afraid of this wizard because he's projecting this terrible image, this loud image, and he's kind of mean and ugly and not very nice at all. Toto comes along. Toto runs in there and he pulls back, or she, I don't know if Toto's a he or a she, not going to deal with that right now. How about this? The dog pulls the curtain back. And when he pulls that curtain back, all of a sudden, Dorothy and the lion and the scarecrow and the Tin Man see that the Wizard of Oz is not this incredibly large, ugly, mean individual. He's just this little old guy that's there behind the curtain, making everybody think that he's something that he's not. What happens in Revelation chapters 12 through 22 is we have a pulling back of the curtain. Because these Christians that are getting this book, and we're getting this book because of them, the Christians that are getting this book, they see the earthly struggle. They see their brothers and sisters in Christ suffering for the cause of Christ. They see their fellow Christians dying for the cause of Christ. What they see is an incredibly powerful human enemy, the Roman emperor. What God wants them to see and what God wants us to see is that behind the curtain there's something else going on, something that they needed to understand, something that we need to understand. So, in this second half of the book, if you want to remember it in some way, remember that image from The Wizard of Oz with the pulling back of the curtain. It will help you, I think, remember what the second half of the book of Revelation is all about. So let's look a little bit more at this as we look at this. Chapters 12 through 22, the deeper spiritual background. The saints on earth, as I've already indicated, see and experience those who are actually carrying out the persecutions. Roman emperor, Roman governors, Roman magistrates, Roman soldiers are carrying out these persecutions. Jews in some places were participating in that and helping the Romans along with that. Individual Romans were helping out with that. That's what the Christians see. What they can't see is who is instigating the persecutions. And that's what chapters 12 through 22 are all about, so that we can see what's going on behind the scenes. This section of the book will make it clear who that is. Now, if we leave the book of Revelation for just a moment and go to the book of Ephesians, we can see that Paul talks about this. Hold your spot there in Revelation chapter 12. We are going to come back. But join me, if you will, in reading Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 through 13. Notice what Paul here says to the Christians in Ephesus. This is Ephesians chapter 6, Verse 10 starting, he says, "Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Therefore take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm." So what Paul tells the church in Ephesus, and what's interesting is that in the book of Revelation, there's a short letter written to the church in Ephesus, isn't there, 30 years later. What Paul tells them here is that we're not really wrestling against flesh and blood. Oh, that's what it looks like. But that's not really what's going on. What's really going on is we are fighting against a whole host of spiritual enemies. They are headed by the devil, headed by Satan, but Satan is by no means the only one. He has forces that work with him and for him and under him. Those are the ones that we're really fighting against. That is the message. That is the message of the second half of the book of Revelation as well. A pulling back of the curtain so we can see what's really going on. We get really wrapped up sometimes in what's going on here in the earth and on earth and in our lives and what all's going around and how Christians are being persecuted in this place or that place. And sometimes we get wrapped up with what's happening with us as Christians. And we forget that what's really going on is this cosmic spiritual battle that we are a part of. That's what Revelation, the second half of Revelation, emphasizes. So, having said all that, that's all introduction. Let's go ahead and get into the chapter itself. So go ahead and take your Bibles and go back to Revelation chapter 12. We've got three characters that we're going to discuss this evening that are introduced to us in Revelation chapter 12. So Revelation chapter 12, let's look at the first of those. We're going to read verses 1 through 6 and talk about each one of the characters individually. So in the first character that we're going to look at is the woman, chapter 12, verses 1 through 6. "And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head 7 diadems. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne, and the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days." Now, we read all 6 of those verses, even though really we have an interspersing of these characters here. We did that because it goes kind of back and forth. And so I want to talk about each one individually, but we needed to read the whole text. So we have the woman here who is introduced to us in the text. She is described as being clothed with the sun, the moon, and the 12 stars. Again, we have an allusion here to the Old Testament, and we are meant to pick up on this. Take your Bibles, hold your spot there in Revelation chapter 12, but go with me to Genesis chapter 37. Genesis chapter 37, we're going to read verse 9. This is the text about Joseph and the dreams that he had. Notice Genesis chapter 37 and verse 9. Genesis chapter 37 and verse 9. "Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. But when it was told to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you? And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind." We remember the story here, don't we? Joseph has these dreams, and this particular dream, in this dream he sees the sun, the moon, and 11 stars, not 12, 11 stars, bowing down to him. When he tells that dream, the father understands what it's about. He understands that it's about him and Joseph's mother and the brothers all bowing down to him. So here in Revelation chapter 12, with this woman that's described here, she is described as being clothed with the sun, the moon, and the 12 stars. She is representing something to us. She is representing to us Israel, Jacob, the forefather of those 12 tribes. So what we're seeing here is this woman being described in very Jewish terminology. We should not miss that at all. Why 12 stars, but 11 in Genesis? Because Joseph would be that 12th star, okay? Those are the other brothers that are there with him. So it couldn't be 12 because he's got 11 brothers. He's the other guy there. All right, so let's go back to the book of Revelation. We're still talking here about the woman. We're going to leave Genesis now, go back to Revelation. This woman represents to us the faithful remnant of Israel, or faithful Israel, if we want to say it that way. She is depicted as being pregnant here, and she gives birth. And after she gives birth, the child that she bears is caught up to heaven. Then the woman flees into the wilderness, where she is nourished for 1,260 days. Now, if you saw that when we were reading through that text, probably that jumped right out at you, because we've looked at those numbers in our previous class when we talked about Revelation chapter 11. 1,260 days is equivalent to 42 months, which is equivalent to 3.5 years, which is equivalent to what we have going on in Revelation chapter 11. Go back up there. This is in the first half of the book. Revelation chapter 11, verses 2 and 3. But do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out, for it is given over to the nations. They will trample the holy city for 42 months. And I will grant authority to my 2 witnesses, and they shall prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. Remember, we talked about that in chapter 11. It's talking about the persecution of the church there, that it is 3.5 years, 42 months, 1,260 days. It represents half of 7. Half of 7. So it is not going to be a complete and perfect amount of time. They are not going to be able to destroy the church. Here in Revelation chapter 12, the exact same terminology is used, only this time it is used in reference, go back to Revelation chapter 12, it is used in reference to the fact that the woman flees into the wilderness, where she is nourished for 1,260 days, the same period of time. Remember, when you're reading the book of Revelation without going through one class, the next class, the next class, you're reading it all the way through. What do you get? You get the end of chapter 11, goes right into chapter 12. You see that number used again. It is meant to remind us of what happened in the previous chapter. So the woman here represents the faithful remnant of Israel. Now, it gets a little tricky here, okay? It gets a little tricky here because the woman clearly is being associated with Old Testament Israel. And yet then Old Testament Israel flees into the wilderness where she's persecuted. So there is a shift here. The shift here is that the man-child, the male child, we're talking about in just a moment, I'll just tell you right now, it's Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is born of faithful Israel. But then the shift is that faithful Israel is no longer physical Israel, but spiritual Israel. We see this elsewhere in the New Testament, where the church is called the faithful Israel, the Israel of God. That's exactly what's going on here. So it's the faithful remnant of Israel through which the Messiah comes into the world, and then it shifts and becomes spiritual Israel. It becomes the church. That's what's going on here in Revelation chapter 12. We should not get lost in how there's a shift in that understanding of who the woman represents. So I choose to just call her as one who is representing faithful, the faithful remnant of Israel, because that encompasses the Old Testament faithful, the faithful that were there in the time of Jesus. I think about Mary, okay, being a part of the faithful remnant of Israel. And then I think about the faithful remnant of Israel, the church, okay? That's who this woman represents. All right, that's our first character. We've got 2 more to look at. Let's go ahead and look then at the next character, which is the dragon. We're not going to read those verses again because we already read them, but let's just talk a little bit about how it is described. This dragon is described as being red in color. Red, of course, is the color of blood, and that's what we should associate that with this dragon. The dragon's not white, dragon's not brown, dragon's not green, the dragon is red. The dragon is also described as having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on its head. So it's got 7 heads, and each one of those heads has a diadem or a crown, if you will. It's also got 10 horns. This description demonstrates the claim of the dragon to extensive control over the world. Now, I want you to note the numbers that are used here, 7 and 10. 7 and 10 both represent completion or a complete number. So you've got 7 diadems, you've got 10 horns. Horns in Old Testament literature represent power. They represent monarchs. And of course, we get the horns and the crowns. We understand that pretty clearly. So this 7 and 10 here, the fact that this dragon is depicted in this way is meant to tell us that this dragon claims extensive control over the world. This terminology, this kind of terminology, is found also in chapter 13 and verse 1 that we will get to next class, where we describe the sea beast. It's also described in chapter 17 and verse 3. And also chapter 17, verses 7 through 13, where it describes the scarlet beast of the prostitute. Those are some other characters that we're going to be talking about in this second half. But this is terminology that's used here of the dragon. Then it's applied to the sea beast. Then it's applied to the scarlet beast of the prostitute. Now contrast that. Contrast this dragon with Christ and how Christ is described here in the book of Revelation. Go back with me, if you would, to Revelation chapter 1. Revelation chapter 1 and verse 5. Revelation chapter 1 and verse 5. And from Jesus Christ, the faithful witness, the firstborn of the dead, and the ruler of kings on earth. Revelation chapter 1 and verse 5 is abundantly clear that regardless of what the dragon may claim, it is Jesus, it is Christ, who is the ruler of kings on earth. Look in Revelation chapter 17 and verse 14. Revelation chapter 17 and verse 14. Let me give you time to flip over to that. Revelation chapter 17 and verse 14. They will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those with him are called and chosen and faithful. So again, Jesus is described here in Revelation chapter 17 as being Lord of lords and King of kings. Regardless of what the dragon thinks, regardless of what the dragon claims, it is Jesus who is king over all the earth. Look with me now at Revelation chapter 19. Revelation chapter 19. Verses 12 through 16. His eyes are like a flame of fire, and on his head are many diadems. And he has a name written that no one knows but himself. He is clothed in a robe dipped in blood, and the name by which he is called is the Word of God. We know absolutely clearly who this is talking about. It's Jesus Christ. And the armies of heaven, arrayed in fine linen, white and pure, were following him on white horses. From his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. He will tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God the Almighty. On his robe and on his thigh he has a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Again, Christ described these 3 times that we looked at as the one who is King of Kings, Lord of Lords, ruler of kings on the earth. Regardless of what the dragon lays claim to, it is Jesus who reigns over the earth. Let's go back to Revelation chapter 12. Let's continue looking at the dragon. Pull up the next slide here. We see the dragon is being described. He has a great tail that swept 1/3 of the stars of heaven down to earth. Now, in regards to this, we need to go once again to the Old Testament. Go with me to Daniel chapter 8. Daniel chapter 8 and verse 10. In Daniel chapter 8 and verse 10, we have a text that is describing a Greek king whose name was Antiochus IV Epiphanes. If you joined me on my Thursday classes on the intertestamental period, we spent a great deal of time talking about this Greek king, Antiochus Epiphanes. Notice in Daniel chapter 8 and verse 10, a description in a vision of this king. This is what we read. It grew great, even to the host of heaven, and some of the hosts and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. So imagery here of a king that even is able to throw the stars of heaven down. That's not literal, is it? Of course not. We know that a king can't do that. This is figurative language to talk about the power that this individual is using. So back in Revelation chapter 12, what we have is this dragon. He sweeps 1/3 of the stars down. Not all of the stars. He's 1/3 of the stars. We've seen that number 1/3 earlier in the text of Revelation where it describes a partial judgment. In this particular case, it is partial success that he is able to do that, but it is not meant to be taken literally. This dragon, then we read in Revelation chapter 12, voraciously waits to devour the male child. I want you to notice, go back to Revelation chapter 12 with me if you will. I want you to notice the language, the imagery that's used here. We are in verse 4, the second half. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. Do you catch that imagery? That's terrible imagery, isn't it? We've got this woman who is in the pangs of childbirth. She's about to deliver this child, and that dragon is just waiting so that he can grab that child and devour it. Make no mistake, the image, the picture that's given to us of the dragon, of Satan, of the devil, because he is identified in verse 9 as being exactly that, is not the image of a little guy with two little horns and a little tail and a little pitchfork. Instead, what's given to us is a dragon that is ready to eat a newborn child. People make light of Satan. People make light of the devil. The Bible never does. The Bible always takes Satan very seriously. And brothers and sisters, we should too. So he waits to devour the child. Is he going to be successful? Let's look on. Here in Revelation chapter 12, I can get my slide to come up. There we go. Because then we get that male child. What in the world's going on here? You know where we're going. The male child here is Jesus Christ. We read here that he is going to rule the nations with a rod of iron. Note in conjunction with that, we're going to look at these three verses. Note in conjunction with that, these three verses. Look at Matthew chapter 2 and verse 6. Matthew chapter 2 and verse 6. When there was a question as to where the king of the Jews was to be born, notice in Matthew chapter 2 and verse 6, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Of course, we know that that's Jesus Christ. Look in Revelation chapter 2 and verse 27. Revelation chapter 2 and verse 27, he will rule them with a rod of iron, as when earthen pots are broken in pieces, even as I myself have received authority from my Father. Look at Revelation chapter 19 and verse 15. We already read this one. From his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. He will tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God the Almighty. Jesus Christ, this male child that the dragon seeks to devour, is going to rule with a rod of iron. Sometimes, again, we have this image of Jesus kind of soft. You know, there's a lot of pictures out there. Jesus with this really nice flowing long hair, really nice, well-creamed, manicured hands, nice looking face, very kind of soft and almost feminine looking. That's the way Jesus is pictured a lot. That isn't how Revelation pictures him. Revelation pictures him as a ruler with a rod of iron. He is prepared to rule in the fullest sense of that word. Well, the male child, though, is not devoured by the dragon. In fact, what we read here in Revelation chapter 12 is that he is caught up to God and his throne. This is a reference to the ascension after the resurrection. We need to understand that all of this imagery here is talking about what's going on with Jesus. So even though the dragon wants to devour him, he in fact is caught up to God and to his throne. Again, that's the ascension back into heaven after the resurrection. Well, then following that, let's go back to Revelation chapter 12, because then following that, what we end up with is war in heaven. What is going on here? Verses 7 through 9. Let's read this together. Revelation chapter 12, verses 7 through 9. Now war arose in heaven. Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard, I'm sorry, we're not going to read verse 10. We're going to stop right there. So just 7 through 9. Satan, there's war in heaven. We've got Michael and his angels on one side. We've got the dragon and his angels on the other. There is no question at all, though, who wins in this battle, because the devil, Satan, is cast out down to the earth. All right, what's going on here? Well, I'm going to suggest to you that verses 7 through 9 are a description of the fact that Satan failed to destroy Christ on earth. Think about this for just a moment. Friday afternoon, Jesus dies. Can you imagine the hideous joy and laughter that came out of Satan's mouth as Jesus expired on the cross? What Satan thought was a victory, in fact, was a defeat for him. Jesus, in fact, even though he dies, is actually victorious. Satan then fails. I do see that we have a question. I am going to get to that in just a minute, okay? Satan fails to destroy Christ in heaven. So he can't destroy him in earth. He can't destroy him in heaven either. This text is not a description of the origin of Satan, but rather events surrounding the resurrection and ascension of Christ. This is not looking back to something that happened way back at the beginning of time. It's something that is looking to what happens in this battle between Jesus, who is on the earth, Jesus who dies and ascends into heaven, and Satan is able in some way or another to wage war there in heaven, but he is defeated. All right, let me read this question real quick. And I have to think about it too. Okay, so why is the child referred to as it in verse 4 here of Revelation chapter 12? This seems out of character for the Bible to describe a child in this way, especially being that the child is Christ. The answer to that question is, I really don't know. It's a good question. It's not how we would refer to that. We usually think of it as an impersonal. Let's see here. I'm doing a very quick look at this word, what this word is in Greek, and what this word and this is very, very quick, okay? It tells me that the word is actually singular and masculine. I don't know whether that helps us out there. It's a pronoun. I would suspect that the ESV translating it as it is because that's the way it should be translated. Let me look. Let me just compare that to a couple of different translations here. Give me just a second. Bear with me as I do that. The New American Standard translates it, instead of it, he might devour her child. The New King James says as soon as it was born. Okay, so I'm not real sure how to understand that, other than sometimes the translations understanding who it refers to translates it in such a way to show that in the English. Sometimes the translations just keep it very, very literal. I don't think there's any question, though, even though it may be jarring in our mind to refer to a child as an it, that may not be quite so jarring in Greek, if that makes any sense. So I'm not sure how else I would answer that, Jennifer, except to just leave it there with what I've said, because that's about all I can say without running the risk of saying something that really doesn't make any sense at all. Good question. Thank you for sending that in. Sorry I couldn't probably help you a little bit more with that than I did. All right. So let's go back. We haven't left Revelation chapter 12, so let's continue here. Again, not a description of the origin of Satan. That's not what's going on here. It's talking about this cosmic battle between the man-child, Jesus Christ, and the dragon, Satan. Okay, so what else do we have here? Verses 10 through 12. Let's continue on. Verses 10 through 12 of the chapter. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, "Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they love not their lives even unto death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short." Okay. So we read here in this victory, this proclamation that the accuser has been thrown down. This is, again, language that comes very much out of the Old Testament. Let's notice a couple of passages here. Let's go to Job, Job chapter 1. If some of these things were reminding you earlier in the class about the book of Job, that's for good reason, because we see some things going on in Job as well. So Job chapter 1, look with me at verses 6 through 11. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. I had a question for a Q&A coming out of this text sometime within the last couple of years, because kind of a question, how in the world is Satan able to come in before the Lord? That kind of bothers us a little bit when we read that, and yet that's exactly what we find happening here in the book of Job. The Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down on it." The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil?" Then Satan answered the Lord and said, here's the accusation, "Does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." Did you catch the accusation? What Satan says is, of course Job fears you. After all, you've put a hedge around him. You protect him. You bless him. Take it all away and he'll curse you to his face. And of course the chapter continues. The text continues, and we see this interplay between God and Satan. This is that accuser aspect of Satan. We see that also in the book of Zechariah. Zechariah chapter 3 and verse 1. Zechariah chapter 3 and verse 1. This is one of those Old Testament apocalyptic books. Then he showed, I'm going to give you time to find that. Okay? Zechariah is not one of those easy books to find in the Old Testament. We hardly ever go there. Zechariah chapter 3 and verse 1. Let me give you just a second to find that. Zechariah 3 and verse 1. Then he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. Again, we see Satan in this role of accuser. He makes accusations against God's people. Made accusations against Job. Makes accusations against Joshua the high priest during the days of Zechariah. Revelation, he's making accusations against God's people as well. But we see here in the victory, here in verses 10 through 12, we see here that Christians have conquered. They've conquered through the blood of the Lamb, Jesus Christ. They've conquered through their faithfulness, even to the point of death. Go back with me to Revelation chapter 12. Look at verse 11 again. He said, "They have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they love not their lives even unto death." Christians remain faithful. They remain faithful even if it means dying for the cause of Christ. And because of that, they are victorious. Let's look on here. We're not quite done with these verses just yet. So we have this victory. There is a woe that is pronounced into the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down in great wrath. Why? His time is short, and he is bent on hatefully destroying as much as is possible. Make no mistake. Brothers and sisters, make no mistake, whoever is listening to this evening, Satan is full of hatred. He hates God's creation. He hates mankind who is created in God's own image. He knows where he will spend eternity, and he wants to take as many of us who bear the image of God into that eternal, infernal place with him. He is not a little guy in a red suit with little horns and a tail and a pitchfork. He is the red dragon, the color of blood, who wants to destroy all that he can. And so he's cast down to the earth, and a woe is pronounced on the earth because of that. He is going to be filled with hatred. Notice then what we read. He renews his war against the woman. Chapter 12, verses 13 through 17, the last part of the chapter. When the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to the place where she is to be nourished for a time and times and half a time. The serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman to sweep her away with a flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman, and the earth opened its mouth, swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth. Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea. So thrown back to the earth, what does Satan do? What does the dragon do? He goes after the woman again, but he is unable to destroy her. God is protecting the woman. The eagle doesn't come along accidentally. The eagle comes to save the woman, to carry her off into the, well, it's not an eagle, I'm sorry. The woman is given 2 wings of a great eagle that is then able to carry her. She's able to carry with those wings into the wilderness. So then, not being able to get after her, what does he do? He goes after the rest of her offspring. All those who, quote, keep the commandments of God and, quote, hold to the testimony of Jesus. It is the church. Okay, so what's going on here? You said earlier, the woman is faithful Israel. Yes. And now we have others that are not a part of the woman, that are pictured as not being a part of the woman. He makes war against them. This is the danger when we get to apocalyptic literature, that it is meant to portray an image, not necessarily to be taken literally, and we need to understand that. So the woman is faithful Israel, but there's some offspring as well that the dragon is going to go after and try to destroy. And of course, in Revelation, what we find out is that he's not able to do that. What we see in this picture and in these 3 characters is that there is war that is going on behind the scenes that those of us on earth are completely oblivious to if it were not for the fact that God reveals it to us. We would see persecuting powers. We would see our brothers and sisters in China might see the Chinese government as the persecuting power instead of seeing Satan, who is behind that persecuting power. Book of Revelation opens that for us, draws back the curtain so that we can see that. All right, a couple of other things to say about this before the class ends. Sorry about that. So there is a note here, depending upon your translation, what you're following along with. Chapter 17 ends with this statement, and he stood on the sand of the sea. Now, sometimes that phrase is attached to chapter 13 and verse 1. I would suggest to you that, in fact, it is a reference to the dragon. He stood. The dragon stands on the sand of the sea. There is a textual variant here. If you are using a New King James Version or a King James Version, the textual variant is, I stood on the sand of the sea, in which case it would be John who is doing that writing. Doesn't really change anything that's going on in the book of Revelation. It doesn't change anything of the big picture. All right, that is Revelation chapter 12. I know it's a lot. It's a lot of material to cover, a lot of information to cover all in one sitting like this. But we've covered those 3 characters, at least for chapter 12. What we're going to do Wednesday night is we're going to look at Revelation chapter 13. So your homework, if you will, this is your assignment if you choose to accept it, is to read Revelation chapter 13, verses 1 through 18.